Hey guys, so for my case study, I did Venezuela. I was born there, but I haven't been back since 2012. I hope you enjoy. So here's a brief overview. I'll start with history, and then I'll cover Venezuela today. And then the three main issues I want to talk about are economy issues and social issues, as well as violence, corruption, and crime. So we'll start with the history, and the colonial period began in 1489 when Christopher Columbus and Alonso de Ojeda arrived in Venezuela. They encountered tribes like the Caribes, the Arawaks, and the Chibchas. And Spanish colonization would last until 1748, when in 1749 there was a first unsuccessful attempt at rebellion, but another rebellion in 1810 led by Simón Bolívar and the Supreme Junta of Caracas would lead to the Declaration of Independence on July 5th, 1811. But Venezuela would not enjoy long-lasting independence until after the independence movement of neighboring Nueva Granada, which is now Colombia and Panama. In 1830, Venezuela would secede from La Gran Colombia, and then it would attract foreign investment and develop its agriculture and education. And then under Juan Vicente Gómez, Venezuela would become the world's largest oil exporter after discovering oil in the Maracaibo Basin in 1914. Rómulo Gallegos would become the first democratically elected president in 1948, but he would be thrown out of office by a coup 8 months after taking it. And then after much economic success, the Bolívar would hit its peak value and surpass the US dollar amidst an oil boom under Caldera. And then Carlos Andrés Pérez would be elected in 1989 during an economic depression, in which case he was forced to implement austerity measures that would cost him his popularity with the people and eventually have him impeached. And then the Bolivarian Revolution would follow. Hugo Chavez was a lieutenant colonel in the Venezuelan army. He had two unsuccessful coup attempts under Carlos Andrés Pérez, for which he was thrown in jail, but shortly after pardoned. And he would win the 1998 election on a very populist platform that appealed a lot to the lower middle classes and the poor. He would implement many social programs that at the time were successful, but they were dependent on oil revenues. He would consolidate power within the executive with the help of the favorable National Assembly at the time, and his presidency would be plagued with corruption scandals for him and for those around him. And he would die in 2013. And soon, shortly thereafter, there would be elections, and Vice President Nicolás Maduro would narrowly win these highly contested elections. And the Bolivarian Revolution is plagued by criticism and corruption scandals and even accusations of being involved in the drug trade. So Venezuela today, here on the bottom left, is a photo of, some would say, President Juan Guaidó, who used constitutional articles to declare himself president as the sitting president of the National Assembly. But Venezuela is not technically a failed state, as some would claim, because the state does project authority over its territory and people. But the main criticism is that it might do so to an extent that violates human rights. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. But regardless, Venezuela's population as of 2018 sits at 31.5 million, 98% of which is Catholic. As we learned, Catholicism is an important force in Latin America. But Venezuela is also extremely ethnically diverse. They have people of all kinds of European descent, from Italian to German to obviously Spanish. And then there are also people of Arab and African descent, as well as indigenous descent. So Venezuela's economy went from being that of the largest oil exporter to a victim of hyperinflation. In 2017, it would report a $381.6 billion GDP, which was 36.7% down over the previous 3 years. Venezuela is also a textbook case study for inflationary trends. In 2014, it reported 60% inflation, which was the highest since 1989. And then in 2017, it would report 1,087%. And the International Monetary Fund estimates that in 2019, Venezuela will reach 10 million% inflation, which is an astounding number. Venezuela's economy is industrial, technically, but it has an extremely large service sector. 70% of the workforce is employed in the service sector. And there's an official figure of 27% unemployment. but this does not include those employed in the informal economy, as we know is a very large source of income for much of the developing world. So under Chavez, there were expropriation practices in which private enterprises were seized by the state. This often failed spectacularly, and businesses were abandoned and left unproductive. Some argued that this was a political tool. Others argue that they may have thought this could work. In any regard, the exchange rate is controlled by the Venezuelan state. So there's an official rate of 45 bolívares soberanos per $1, whereas the parallel or actual rate is 3,809 bolívares soberanos per $1. And this is after a radical move to slash 5 zeros off the end of the currency by Maduro's presidency. And that would put the old currency would be valued at 3.8 million bolívares per $1, which again just gives you an idea how insane the scale of inflation is in Venezuela. This has also led to an increased black market exchange for any type of international currency, but particularly US dollars, euros, and Colombian pesos. Access to the parallel market is crucial for some people, and it's very difficult to survive without some kind of exchange. And some companies have even started paying salaries in foreign currency, and even some workers in the informal sector have demanded payment in US dollars. This is a historical trend of the Venezuelan bolívar versus the official rate versus the actual rate. So Venezuela is a case in which the resource curse can be applied to an incredible extent. The resource curse is also known as Dutch disease, and the theory is that countries with an abundance of natural resources tend to have less economic growth, democracy, and worse development outcomes than those without. Oil has crowded out other sectors of the economy, and Venezuela's economy was incredibly reliant on oil production, and so were the social programs implemented by Chavez. But when oil prices would fall, those social programs were left out of funding, people were left without jobs, and Venezuela's economy would take a tremendous hit. Venezuela also has a history of oil gifting, in which Venezuela's relationship with Cuba was founded on Cuba getting oil for sometimes free and sometimes for next to nothing. So that also contributed to Venezuela's economic suffering. But socially, Venezuela faces an exodus. 2.7 million Venezuelans have left in the last few years. That's approximately 9% of the population at the time. They're going everywhere from the United States to Spain, but particularly to neighboring Latin American countries, especially Colombia. These Venezuelans who have left are sending home remittances for the family members that have left behind, and some people are only managing to get by because of those remittances. Venezuela's brain drain issue is broader than that of most countries because it doesn't just affect the professional sector, it affects technical sectors. Electricians, plumbers, oil workers, miners have all left the country. And aside from a shortage of skilled labor, Venezuela has also has shortages of every other kind as well: food, medicine, hygienic products. Water is rationed and access is intermittent at best. And most recently and most importantly, power in urban centers like Caracas and Maracaibo. Because of that skilled labor shortage, there's no one to maintain the electrical grid, and there have been blackouts this year that have lasted up to 7 days. One of the most important social issues is that of education. Venezuela's public school does supposedly provide free and compulsory education from 6 to 15, and there is free secondary education available, but nearly half of the adult population has no secondary education. Middle and upper class families opt for private schooling, which neglects the vocational and technical sectors. There are plenty of colleges throughout Venezuela, one in every state, and a ton in Caracas itself. But these colleges, the funding for these colleges has caused neglect of the public system, which has increased dropout rates. And the Bolivarian Revolution is said to have had an overall negative effect on the education of pretty much all Venezuelans. Violence and crime are also incredibly prevalent in Venezuela, and making it world famous for such things. The murder rate figures vary. In 2014, it is said there were 53.7 murders per every 100,000 Venezuelans. In 2018, that went up to 81.4 per 100,000 Venezuelans. And the United States Department of State reports 73 daily violent deaths in Venezuela for the year of 2018. Colectivos are a type of organized gang. They are the armed wing of the Bolivarian Revolution. This just means civilians that were given guns by the government. They were responsible for the murder of protesters in 2014, and the government sanctions them, claiming that they are useful peacekeepers, although they have been proven to be involved in international crime, as well as things like auto theft and kidnapping. Corruption. So on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, Venezuela scored an 18 out of 100, 100 being very clean, 0 being highly corrupt. That makes it the most corrupt country in the Western Hemisphere, and more so under the Chavez and Maduro administrations, which were plagued by scandals and accusations of misuse of public funds. Venezuela is also accused of being what is known as a narco state, and that it is directly involved in the international drug trade. So I don't want to give you the impression that everything in Venezuela is dark and dreary. These are extremely trying times for the Venezuelan people. But there are certain things that the Venezuelans should be proud of, and that we'll always be proud of. Some of those things are things like tepuis, geographic figures. Tepuis are flat-top mountains that exist only in Venezuela. That particular one pictured on the left is Mount Roraima. Tepui translates in the Bemon language to, house of the gods. So there's an immense pride in certain geographic figures. Photos on the right are of protests in 2014 and 2018, which is just a symbol of Venezuelans' willingness to unite in the face of injustice, as well as their commitment to nonviolence, peace, and what they hope to be a democratic transition of power someday. On the left is the occurrence of Catatumbo lightning over Lake Maracaibo, which occurs once a year. Photographers travel from thousands of miles away to get photos of this event. On the right is the Orinoco River, which is the second longest river in South America, which is second to only the Amazon, and it is the world's 8th largest river. I don't know what kind of Venezuelan I would be if I didn't include a photo of an arepa in my presentation. This one is an arepa de pabellon, which has shredded cheese, shredded beef, fried plantains, and beans. Other sources of Venezuelan pride are its U20 soccer team that reached the U20 World Cup finals a few years ago, and there were Venezuelans from around the world that got up at ungodly times of day to watch this game. I remember getting up at 5 a.m. and driving to my friend's house to watch this game. Venezuelans are also incredibly proud of their baseball and the part it plays in Venezuelan culture. Venezuela has produced some of the best baseball players in history, guys like Miguel Cabrera, Maglio Ordóñez, Jose Altuve, Omar Vizquel, Johan Santana, Bobby Abreu, and most recently Ronald Acuna Jr., who's an outfielder for the Atlanta Braves, who won the 2018 National League Rookie of the Year. Another photo there included is of El Ávila, which separates Caracas from the coast. And a lot of Venezuelans, when asked what they miss the most about, home, is the fact that they could wake up every morning and see this spectacular mountain, this beautiful view from, their urban center. And it is a very big source of Venezuelans' pride. So my conclusion is that Venezuela's case study is, one for the history books, maybe not mine, but there are certainly going to be books written about what happened and what went wrong in Venezuela. But there should also be an emphasis on its beauty and uniqueness of, geographically. Up in the right is a photo of Los Roques, which is an archipelago. There was a huge, scene for tourists. And then there's Angel Falls, which is the world's largest, highest uninterrupted waterfall. But Venezuelan culture is also incredible. It used to export telenovelas and musicians. It was its orchestra was once world famous. And Venezuelans in general have a strong national identity, not in the nationalist sense, but they love their country regardless of where they are in the world. And the future is uncertain, yes, but there should be optimism in the sense that Venezuelan civil society is incredibly strong and resilient, and in the face of a government that murders its people, Venezuelans continue to protest and